Here we are today to talk about another mutual interest, and that is Viktor Frankl and logotherapy. And I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you. I have here, I don't know if the filters will filter it out, or kind of will. Here's your most recent book, Viktor Frankl and the Psychology of the Soul. And of course, here's the other one. Let's see if I can get it there. Think Good and It Will Be Good. So let people know about that. Your website is torahpsychology.org. And since I have a Southern accent, it's kind of funny to me when I speak to non-Jewish people and I say Torah. They're like, "Oh, that's your Southern accent." I said, "No, that's a long O in there."
That's really funny.
I think I think in Crown Heights they say Torah. I'm not sure.
Torah. I think people in other parts of Brooklyn say Torah, but you're right in
Torah.
there. You're right in there in the Jewish community. Well done.
Thank you. What I can do Hebrew Torah. אני יכול לדבר קצת עברית.
Gam
So,
Ivrit, Yoter Tov.
yeah, thank you. Okay, so you have other responsibilities. I do not want to waste your time, but thank you so much for being with me. This is basically normally I've been doing these interviews and podcasts for about 2, 3 years now for my first website, which is called
Hmm.
pastorallogotherapy.com, in which we talk about logotherapy in the context of ministry. I also have just recently started the Atlanta Center for Logotherapy, and I'm hoping to achieve something like what you do with Torah psychology here. And so, thank you for being with me today. I'd like to just get right into it. Not your first book, but the first book I wanted to bring up again is Think Good and It Will Be Good. And my impression of this one is that it's part. Um, textbook or book on Torah psychology, part workbook because you have plenty of exercises and meditation moments and so forth for the reader. And then, of course, I sort of said part prayer book because you have a nice um, second half of the book, which is based on duties of the heart, uh, or the gates, yeah, the duties of the heart by Ibn Pekuda, who was uh, I guess, an early Renaissance or late medieval rabbi. Um, and I'm familiar with duties of the heart. I haven't read it all the way through, but um, to introduce this book, can you talk briefly about Torah psychology in general and how you integrate that into your practice?
Well, thank you so much, first of all, this wonderful opportunity to talk to you about Viktor Frankl, about its Jewish roots, his Jewish roots, and clearly the reference to my work is encapsulated in my website, torahpsychology.org. And I want to go back to why I started torahpsychology.org. Both of us, you and I, are in a similar space. We're both people that wear the cloth, as we say. We're both in this field of religion, religiosity, and we're both in the field of psychology. And there's no greater person that can synthesize these two worlds other than the great Viktor Frankl, who I think dedicated his life towards creating a bridge between the finite and the infinite. I think that was one of his ultimate purposes in life was to create a psychology that would enable humanity to embrace what he calls a natural human phenomenon in his videos and his
Right.
writings of the belief in God. So I was very interested in this point because I was trained in graduate school and became a licensed therapist. And we never read about or learned about Viktor Frankl.
Mhm.
I read about Viktor Frankl, as most people have, in Man's Search for Meaning. But in graduate
Yeah.
school, there's no mention of Viktor Frankl, maybe one page somewhere, but he was seen mostly as a philosopher, physician, but he was not really accepted in the world of psychotherapy, unfortunately, because he went against the
Right.
Geist of his time, which was Sigmund Freud and Alfred Adler, as we know the famous stories of him bucking the trends. Now, that's not easy to do, to buck the trends of Sigmund Freud. It'd be like going against Albert Einstein with a new theory of relativity, which is hard to do because it was proven to be correct to some degree.
Right.
But Freud's work is different because there's no real, if you look at Freud's work, there's no microscope that we can use to measure inside the brain. Does an id, an ego, or superego actually exist? So
Right.
that's one thing we could say about Freud. But Frankl was bothered by the fact of Freud's reductionism,
Mm.
reducing man to a machine, to an animal, taking out his soul. Look at the very description of the unconscious mind according to Freud. There's an id, an ego, and the superego. Where's the soul in that thing? So you look at man historically, Freud is the end of the 1800s, early 1900 period. If you look at man before that period in history, for thousands of years, the model would be, if everybody would make a model of the unconscious, would be the soul would be there somewhere. We have in
Yeah.
Jewish writings, in Hasidic and Kabbalistic thought, predating Freud by like 200 years, this idea there's two souls. There's an animal soul, and there's a
Mm.
godly soul. We've always accepted this
Mm.
godly part of human beings. But Freud took it out and he reduced man to a machine, basically. And Viktor
Yeah.
Frankl was very bothered by that. He was
Mm.
bothered by that in high school. He has stories he talks about. He wondered if we're just reducing man to this, what's the purpose of life? I think he asked
Right.
that. I think you saw that it was in chemistry class or somewhere. So he was
Right.
bothered by
Yeah.
this, yeah, as a teenager. And he was obviously a very brilliant man. He was a prodigy, clearly.
Mm.
He was in
Yeah.
medical school very early in life. He had two majors. He had both psychiatry and neurology. And he was also accepted by Sigmund Freud earlier on. He would correspond with Sigmund Freud, but he started disagreeing with him. And then he would disagree with Adler, who was Freud's protege. He was kicked out of both societies. So to make a long story short, I decided after becoming a therapist for a few years, I wanted to explore more about Viktor Frankl and logotherapy. And I ran two
Yes.
conferences about Viktor Frankl. And I'm happy to send you the link. You can watch these two interesting conferences.
Wonderful. Yes.
This
Thank
is
you.
2016, two conferences. And I brought specialists from around North America to talk about Viktor Frankl and his impact on their lives. I brought Jews, non-Jewish therapists to talk at this conference. I brought a rabbi, Rabbi Bulka from Ottawa, who is his real personal rabbi, Rabbi Reuven Bulka, who wrote many books about Freud, about Frankl, and so on.
Several of them right here on my bookshelf.
There you go. Great. So I knew Rabbi Bulka very well. So I ran these two conferences. We trained about 400 different therapists and lay leaders about Frankl. And then
Mm.
I went on to create this institute, Torah Psychology Institute, which you see on my website. And I train
Mm.
people from around the world. I mostly teach lay people through the lens of coaching
Mm.
systems,
Right.
incorporating Viktor Frankl. And then after I started writing two books. And my first book around the time of that conference, just after the conference, was Think It Will Be Good. And I was blending together Frankl's ideas with ancient Jewish wisdom and the book, The Duties of the Heart, which we can discuss afterwards. And then
Mm.
2024, released my second book on Frankl, which is called Viktor Frankl and the Psychology of the Soul. I would say that was my icing of the cake. That was my book, which I said my goal of that book, this new book, was to show people how to utilize logotherapy, the therapy of meaning, in psychotherapy. Because I wanted to take Viktor Frankl from a figure who was more philosophical. And unfortunately, Frankl didn't really teach, he didn't create a school uh, as
Yes.
much as Freud would create schools of learning. There's Viktor Frankl Institutes, but I
Right.
do not believe that he was successful in only in small areas, but bringing logotherapy into the mainstream of psychotherapy. So my book, Viktor Frankl, The Psychology of Soul, is the attempt to bring his ideas into mainstream psychology.
Mm. Nice. And that's kind of the rub with Frankel is that he's intellectual, and most people don't know that. Most people have only read Man's Search for Meaning and the story of his, his biography in the first half of the book is very emotional. And even though he writes it in a very scientific way, uh, I think most people don't catch it. You have to read it several times to realize that there's three phases, and he's trying to discuss this almost from a detached position, and then people read the second half, logotherapy in a nutshell, and they think, oh, this is all there is to it. And that's a real shame. But I have found that the more I read and the deeper I go, the just how engrossing his approach is and how true to life it seems to be. And my favorite, of course, is Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning, his doctoral dissertation for his philosophy degree, uh, Der unbewusste Gott. And
The
so the
unconscious
wonderful,
God.
the
Mhm.
unconscious God, which is something that I'm leading up to, of course. Uh, how do you understand? I'll just flip around my questions a little bit. How do you understand the unconscious God from your practice of logotherapy and Torah psychology?
Well, as I referenced before, the idea of the unconscious God. Let's go back to Viktor Frankl's history, first of all. He writes in his
Hmm.
autobiography, which was published posthumously, he writes that he was a descendant of the Maharal of Prague. He found
Hmm.
this, his mother told him, and he found this on certain tombstones. That was Rabbi Yehuda Loewy, the great Maharal of Prague, who lived in the 1500s in Czechoslovakia and Prague. And he was one of the greatest Kabbalists and philosophers, Jewish philosophers in history. And so I believe he was deeply influenced unconsciously again by his lineage. And there's certain a
Yes.
level of absorption in Jewish culture, which is unknown. Now, what I find fascinating about Frankl is he's in Vienna. That's the birthplace or where Sigmund Freud and Adler worked. And it was a tremendous geist against religiosity. It was a tremendous geist of secularism in those days. Yet somehow,
Yes.
when Frankl talks in his autobiography, he talks about his father, who kept kosher and perhaps the Sabbath until the First World War. There's a story he tells where his father was keeping kosher. He worked for the government. He was an accountant, I believe, in some ministry, and the minister made sure he had kosher food wherever he went. He was actually asked Viktor Frankl to recite the Holy Prayer Friday nights, the Kiddush, where we raise a glass of wine, we sanctify the Sabbath. So he had a lot of Jewish culture. I think he unconsciously absorbed the teaching of his ancestry, which is from the Maharal of Prague. From the Maharal of Prague in the 1500s comes in the 1700s the Hasidic movement, highly influenced by the Maharal. You have the Baal Shem Tov, and then you have his disciples. One of his greatest disciples was Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. There's seven
Hmm.
altogether. He wrote a book called the
Hmm.
Tanya, and in the Tanya, it explicitly says, as I quoted before, there are two souls. There's a godly soul and an animal soul.
Hmm.
So man is similar to animals. In this animal soul, we have bodily functions, we eat, we procreate, and so on. But there's a spiritual side of man, which is referenced in the Tanya. The Tanya is quoting the Bible and quoting the prayer book, that God blew into man a breath of life. In the beginning of Genesis, it says that man was created by, the Medrash says he was created from earth, from the four corners of the earth, of the world, and that God breathed into man, b'yipach b'apav nishmas chaim. He breathed into man a breath of life. So the Tanya sources the introduction to man's soul as God, so to speak, performing the first CPR in history, breathing into
Hmm.
mankind this soul. That soul is what Frankl is referring to as the religio, which I
Hmm.
mentioned in my
Yeah.
book. That is what he talks about in the unconscious God, the religio. And he says, if we can't detect, there's no science for the id. So as much as the id is there, as much as the perhaps the edible complex is there, why not posit that the soul is also there? If we're going to go to the unconscious world, we could look at different forces. So let's assume what man assumed for thousands of years, there's also a soul there. And that's what he's referring to in the unconscious God. So how does he know this exactly? Again, I just think he absorbed it. Why is he
Yeah.
such a religious personality? It puzzled me. But some people have that spark. And I think he uncovered
Yeah.
his unconscious spark as well. It just didn't make sense to him intuitively. He was in touch with his father, perhaps. And therefore, he wanted a world which had order and meaning to it. And that was, I think, comforting to his clients as well, as opposed to a world like he quotes Jean-Paul Sartre, who said, you have to shoulder the suffering in the world, suffer the meaninglessness of the world. He could not accept the world of meaninglessness. He himself sought out
Yeah.
meaning, and it's no accident that the book was called, well, he didn't call it this, of course, but his publisher called it Man's Search for Meaning later on. I think that's what he was looking for himself.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess we kind of uh, fast forwarded towards the end of my questions down here because that's one of the things that I was going to ask you. Do we think that Frankel tried to rewrite his psychology from a Jewish perspective, but in scientific and in philosophical terminology, or if it was just sort of unconscious in him. And I think what I hear you saying is that it was part of his upbringing, as I guess in Yiddish you would say he got it with his mamalushin, right, with his mother's milk. And so I think that that's one of the things that's so interesting is that those of us who are religious, we find his logotherapy and existential analysis so compatible with with our anthropology, with our understanding of humanity as having a body, a mind, and a spirit. We could trip all over this terminology though. And I was trying to decide just based on my Hebrew knowledge, when you talk about the unconscious or the spiritual unconscious, what Hebrew term would you use to for that to translate?
Yeah, we have it in Kabbalah literature, nefesh
Hmm.
elokit, the soul,
Elokit?
nefesh.
Yes.
Elokah is the word for God, the godly soul.
Mhm. Yes, yes.
And it's clear, it's clearly there. And Frankl wrote another book called In the Unconscious God, and it's just I find it almost comical to read it. He's playing with Freud at that point. He's saying,
Mhm.
well, we can interpret dreams with the id in the animal complex, but there's no science to it. We could equally interpret dreams as the godly soul is speaking through the unconscious mind as
Yes.
well. So he has many terms which people would could interpret as being phallic symbols. He could interpret as being a spiritual symbol as well. And he does
Yes.
that in his dream analysis, borrowing on Freud's understanding of dream analysis. And he says that, and I found this as a psychotherapist, and I write about this in the book. When I work with my clients, now I'm trained as a marriage and family therapist, but I went back to school, went back to postgraduate training, did a lot of work in CBT. You'll see my
Hmm.
model of therapy, which I'll show you in a minute, is very based upon cognitive behavioral therapy, how the
Hmm.
mind works
Sure.
on different levels. But
Hmm.
he clearly saw, and as I do with my clients, and I'm looking for that spark within them
Hmm.
because it's not I that's going to heal them. It's they're going to heal themselves with that spark, so to speak. I call these resources. I'm always looking for natural, inherent spiritual resources. Some
Hmm.
people will experience those resources as art and music,
Hmm.
literature, dance, nature. They'll experience it in different ways. And that's okay for certain people. There's other people that find that spiritual resource through spirituality, whether it's taking a
Hmm.
walk in the park, whether it's going to
Hmm.
synagogue, church, and so on. Or there are those who meditate and think about godliness in the world. There's all these different types of levels. As a therapist, I'm not even speaking as a logotherapist or as a rabbi, as a therapist,
Hmm.
I believe for many years it's those resources which were very healing. And perhaps people forgot about those resources. They had them as children. They become very buried with our pressure and our busyness and just surviving. But those are the resources
Yes.
which heal people. And Frankl was noting that. Unfortunately, psychotherapy wouldn't talk about those resources. Freud would say these are just imaginative things which people came up. They were like crutches to help us survive the forces of the world. Come up with a God to protect us against nature. That's
Mm.
what Freud wrote about. But it's really not true. It's a relationship we have with our creator, and we have to plug into that and help. I look at it as like you're blowing on some embers of a flame. When you blow on that ember, it turns into a flame. I'm looking to spark people's flames, and those are the spiritual
Yes.
resources.
Yeah. Exactly like just a slightly different rewording of how Viktor Frankl and other local therapists talk about it. It's to awaken what's already within you. And so I really I think that that is the value of this approach. But when you're using various methods, CBT and EMDR, and of course logotherapy and so forth, we're just talking about different ways of getting at the person. But I'm also assuming that when you enter the realm of the religious, that the Torah part of psychology is going to always take precedence in some way or other. That that when we get to religion, logotherapy kind of screeches to a halt in terms of Frankl never, you know, never allowed logotherapy to be used as a sort of as a religious tool per se. Am I making sense?
You
Um,
are. He talks a lot about this. He realized that if he got too spiritual, people wouldn't be able to incorporate it. It would be too
yeah.
anti-Western. So he was fighting all that Westernism at the time,
Yes.
rationality and so on. So he had to. He said it right. He said it outright. He said, "I had to create a system which everybody could access, whether religious
Right. Right.
not or not." But you do see when
Yes.
when he's allowed to go free, he goes very spiritual. And he
He
does that in the
does.
unconscious. Yeah, he really does. In the unconscious God,
Yeah.
he goes spiritual, and man's search for ultimate meaning. He jumps way up there in spirituality and godliness. He has no problem
Yes.
with it. But this is what I notice in my work in trying to piece together what he was trying to create and create like a structure for his work. I believe what he did was he created that bridge, and then he also piggybacked on other psychotherapies. And he made a
Mm.
remarkable statement. I write that in my book. I don't remember exactly where I found it, whether it was an audio or I read it in one of his books. He wrote that logotherapy did not come to replace psychotherapy. It came to
Mm.
complete psychotherapy. And I
Right.
write about that in my
Yes.
introduction. When he said that, I think he
Mhm.
gave license to people that he's an addendum. He's not going to get rid of CBT. And that's where I think people make
Right.
a mistake. I'm studying
Hmm.
CBT, EMDR, psychoanalysis, or logotherapy. I don't think he envisioned
Right.
logotherapy to be that or. I think what he meant was you could utilize CBT, and I'll show you how I do it. I'll show you my chart in a minute. But at the top of the CBT pyramid is God and spirituality. You can move towards that. For example, in
Mm.
EMDR, which I do a lot of work in, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. For your audience that might not be familiar with it, this is a trauma
Mhm.
therapy invented about 35 years ago. It's highly successful to treating PTSD and people from war and other victims of terror and rape and so on. So I started
Yes.
noticing that it will deal with the animal side of the human being, like the
Hmm.
emotions. Sometimes the physiology will shift, blood pressure goes down. That's the animal
Hmm.
side. But really, the ultimate healing happens when you get to the spiritual side as well. So after I work through my clients with PTSD through EMDR, I just noticed there's a moment that as I talk to them, by the way, I'm noticing their spiritual resources. They'll often go to them. When I feel the healing is on the way, I'll then introduce
Yes.
logotherapy. So I
Right. Yeah.
see logotherapy piggybacking, working together very well with other therapies. You have to know when to use it. And that's what I talk about in my book as well.
Yeah. So I guess my question is like when I'm discussing, uh, well, let me just give you a psychological example. When I, as a minister, a family member or an acquaintance approaches me, will you do our child's wedding? My answer is certainly. The next question is, are you asking for a Christian wedding or are you asking for a civil wedding? And so the reason being is that sometimes my family, not all my family members are very religious. So, I can do a civil wedding. I'm not real crazy about the idea because I think that we're talking about a relationship between two people and God. But my point is that there's a sense in which if I'm a logotherapist and I hang out my shingle, somebody may come to me for logotherapy, but not for religious counseling or whatever. And in the state of Georgia, it's a very complicated issue, probably in New York as well. You can't, I can do pastoral counseling all day long as I'm a pastor in a church. Currently, I'm not a pastor in a church. Therefore, if I put out counseling on in anything and I'm not a licensed counselor, I'm in trouble. So, the point that I'm getting to here is if someone is seeking counseling and uh, the religion comes up, it surfaces. Certainly, there is a point at which you can quote scripture. There's a point at which you can say, this goes beyond what logotherapy or CBT or anything else talks about. Now, let's talk about Torah. Let's talk about, how do you heal at this higher level. I hope that makes sense. At least in the Will to Meaning, Frankl talks about logotherapy takes you to a certain point, and then after that, beyond that, the transcendent is religion. He almost calls it a fourth dimension. He stops a little short of saying that. So, Oh,
Well, I would say like this, I go to where my client is.
yes.
So in many instances, their spirituality could be music, it could be
Mm,
exercise, it could be painting, it could be hiking, it could be
mhm,
helping people. But there's those who need to go to a deeper level, which they often will. I mean, if you really come down to it, we don't really understand why somebody suffers. We don't really
mm.
understand. So somebody who's a victim of rape, somebody who's a victim of loss, God forbid loss, death in their family, no one can tell them what the reason is. So there's one place to go, and people go there. And what I'm finding is, Reverend, is that the my clients are more apt to even delve into spirituality. They're not as sensitive as I am towards the division between church and state. That's what I've discovered. I'm
Yeah,
not so
I think that's
scared.
true.
I'm a licensed therapist. I'm not so scared to go into God with them. Of course, if they want to go there,
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
preaching in my, I mean, I
yeah.
could preach elsewhere. I do a lot of, outreach and teaching, but in the therapeutic room, I'm here to heal their emotions and their minds, not their religion. But I will go where the client wants to go. I'll just detect what's there naturally. And I find more often than not, it's all there. There's no atheist in a foxhole, as the expression goes. Most people are very
I
spiritual
agree.
beings, and I'm not scared to go there. And I help them find their own level of spirituality. And I just want to cue into that. That's that next dimension I go into with them, and people are very satisfied.
I agree. I think that's a very good approach, and it makes a lot of sense to me. Um, I think that probably what got hammered into me was from instructors who were like, don't baptize logotherapy or don't make it, don't think for a minute that you're Christianizing it. And that was never the intention, of course. The intention was that logotherapy is compatible. Our understanding of how humans are made, and we say created in the image of God. There's a body, there's a mind, there's a spirit, there's logotherapy and existential analysis. So I think that's a very good point. It does seem to me that 9 out of 10 people uh, are already there. Even if they're not religious, they're okay with that. And that kind of raises the point that when Frankl was alive and he died in, I think, 1997, there's a term that was not as common in 1997 that is very prevalent now, and that is spiritual but not religious.
Mm.
And I think that change, that shift in people's thinking also affects the way we view logotherapy as a spiritual psychology.
Very much. So let me share with you my chart, how
Yeah.
I see logotherapy existing in a psychological framework. And I think your viewers will appreciate this as well. So
Yes.
this is on page 14 of my introduction. I'm sure you've seen this diagram
Yes,
before. This
I
is how
sure
I
have.
conceptualize. So for those of you who are not psychologists, levels 1 to 6, let me make it a little bigger. Levels 1 to 6 are basically uh, cognitive behavioral therapy, the way CBT looks at the different levels of conscious and unconsciousness. So when a client comes to you, they'll come at level 1, my stomach is hurting, my heart is racing, I'm feeling very anxious. So
Mhm.
as you go up this pyramid, I believe what's higher influences that which is below it, which is lower. So where do behaviors and sensations, racing hearts come from? They come from emotions, fear. So if I'm on level 2, I have a lot of fear. Well, it's going to influence my heart racing or my palm sweating. But where do my emotions come from? They come from my thoughts. If I
Mhm.
think negatively, I tend to feel negative things. If I think there's a robber at the gate or at the window, I tend to feel it more intensely. It's my right. But where do my thoughts come from? They come from habitual thinking patterns. You'll see with clients that have depression and anxiety, for example, they have a lot of negative thinking patterns. They do a lot of black and white thinking, either safe or unsafe, good or bad. They overestimate danger. That's like going on an airplane is overestimating danger and so on. These are thinking patterns. So if I have negative thinking patterns, I tend to have certain thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. But where do my thinking patterns come from? In CBT, they come from my beliefs. The three
Mhm.
core negative beliefs are worthless, powerless, and unlovable. So if I have these core beliefs, then I tend to have negative thinking patterns, bad thoughts, emotions, and behavior. But where do my beliefs, where are they formed? Usually from my childhood. I just call it identity and personality. We grow up
Mhm.
inculcated with certain belief systems. Okay. So these first six levels are what most psychotherapists deal with. They look into your thinking patterns, your belief systems. But this is where logotherapy comes in from level 7 to 10.
Hmm.
And also, if you look at below, so 1 to 6 is all about the self, how you were developed, what's happened to you. But levels 7 to 10 are beyond the self. This is where I believe logotherapists go into what is meaningful for a client. Is where they start going beyond themselves, meaningful experiences. That could be learning a language, teaching little children, volunteering in a hospital, volunteering for poor people, and so on. That's a meaningful act. We want to shift people away from self-focus, what Frankl talked, considered to be hyper-reflection, reflection on self, to de-reflect away from the self. So if you start getting into meaningful experiences, I think this is much more rewarding for our clients than just talking about their childhoods. Because what are they
Hmm.
going to
Right.
do in between the sessions? If they're focusing on
Mhm.
fulfilling a meaning, which Frankl talks about how to get that, that's a great value to their psychological well-being as well. But where does meaning come from? It's talked about that meaning comes from our values. So values give things meaning. So why is volunteering meaningful? Because I value loving kindness. And values are timeless ideas, values that we can always ascend to that take us beyond ourselves, that give us strength and stamina, like kindness, courage, truthfulness, citizenship, and so on. So in my therapy and in my book, I talk about helping clients help them clarify what their values are. But in a historical
That's
sense, where do many values come from? They come from our spirituality. Our religion
hmm
often defines what's valuable to us. Judaism and Christianity talk about you shouldn't kill. That's why it's a value in our society. Other societies don't hold by that, don't believe in that. Killing's okay. So our values are influenced greatly by our culture, in this case, Judeo-Christian civilization. And there are some people that will go there with you. And there's some people that want to get to the source of religion. And Frankl talks about this, not just a task that was given to us, but a task giver, Frankl talks about.
Yes. Right.
And that is God himself. And
Mhm.
that is a very powerful spiritual resource that people can tune into God. And there's many ways to get there. That could be prayer, that could be meditation, that could be thinking and studying God's existence and so on. So these are all the values I try to find out where my clients want. I will go to where they're at. Some people stop at meaning and
Mhm.
values. I'll stop there. Others want to go to spirituality. And what I also found is, which is fascinating, some people don't like spirituality. They just want to go to God.
Mm.
And that's
Yeah, that's
very
interesting.
important. They're not religious practice, Christians or Jews, but they believe in God. Why not talk about that with them? They're not interested
hmm
in religious practice. They want to get to God himself.
Hmm. So, by spirituality, then, are you referring to maybe a tradition of practice such as Judaism or Christianity, or I mean, for some, I guess it could be just yoga or whatnot, but you're talking about actually ways that people embody their spiritual set
Yes.
for their values.
Yeah,
Okay,
the
good to
spirituality
know.
could be religious spirituality. It could be
hmm
just universal spirituality. It could be walking in a park. It
Yeah.
could be nature. I mean, who would say that going to the Grand Canyon is not a spiritual experience? There's a certain awe, experiences of awe
Yeah.
that one experiences. So that
Yes.
could deeply
Mm.
be when you're standing in the Grand Canyon, you see, I just imagine God carving it himself. So I get in touch with the creator at the Grand Canyon. So for
Yeah.
some people, that's their gateway to higher levels of spirituality. And isn't that
Agreed.
more satisfying to think about the Grand Canyon than to think about one's negative thinking patterns, which cause them anxiety? So people can always choose. And Frankel's big into choice, really big into making a choice.
Yes.
It's either this
Absolutely.
way, I want to be this way, or that way. He talks about this in his interviews. So the
Mhm.
same as with your thought patterns. What are you going to focus on? You're going to focus on negative thinking patterns, or are you going to focus on spirituality, loving kindness, godliness, and the Grand Canyon? You can make a choice with your clients what you can help them focus on. They have to decide to do that for themselves. But I think this is much more valuable
Mm.
to focus on
I
these
agree.
levels 7 and 10. And of course, mentioning before, all the psychotherapies, whether it's CBT or EMDR,
Mm.
I would maybe put in psychoanalysis a little bit, whatever, all these therapies are really 1 to 6. Frankl is seven
Mm.
to 10.
Right. Yes. Agreed. Yes, absolutely. Very, very nice and practical too. And I think that's the interesting thing about your books here is that there's this sort of balance between the practical and the theoretical. I mean, uh, on our end, we have to be much more versed and much more uh, understanding of the total picture, but we also have to be able to work with the person that is in front of us. And I love the statement that Frankl made in one of his books where he said, I just started listening to my patients. And he talks about the man on the street. He talks about, and even the preference for phenomenology is in looking for, I guess, evidence based on experience as opposed to just pure theory. So I appreciate that very
It's a good
much.
point. And the quote you're quoting Frankel is his interview with Jerry Long,
Ah,
who was a quadriplegic who broke his neck. And in this wonderful interview, it looked like the late 70s, early 80s. He's interviewing Jerry Long. Your listeners can find it on YouTube. Just search for Viktor Frankl, Jerry Long, Long. And he says it's about the man on the street. He just listened to them. He just listened to what they had to say. The wisdom of the heart, he talks about. It's the average
got it.
man that knows more than about psychotherapy than the psychotherapist, he's saying. And listen to them carefully.
Mm,
You have to help them detect um, the internal spiritual wisdom that people have and just kind of escalate it to consciousness a little bit. And that's going to heal them. That's what I look at. If you read my book in towards the let's say the last third, I have all these dialogues that I show how to do
yes.
psychotherapy, how do I do logotherapy with my clients? You'll see that I've set up my system from 1 to 10 in that pyramid. And then I have all these dialogues where I'm showing the reader what I'm thinking about as my client is talking. So sometimes I'll say, oh, that's a
Yes.
value. That's
Right.
spirituality. That's godliness. And I'll just reflect on what they're going to and keep on going higher and higher on these levels with them.
Very, yes, very much so. Very nicely done. I'm sorry I was distracted. Somebody called me while we were talking, but
No problem.
I ignored that. So uh, I wanted to respond to what you were saying about Jerry Long and about I think that ultimately what it comes down to is that as you mentioned, there are no atheists in foxholes, and I think that somewhere behind the scenes in Frankel's thought is the idea that in each one of us is a deeply ingrained religious sense, as he mentions in the unconscious God, that we may not realize it, we may never connect, but it's there. And if we can be awakened, it's a source of healing and power and meaning for each of us. Thank you so much. I know you have to go, so I don't want to keep you any
I'm
longer.
actually teaching one of my Viktor Frankl classes in five
Okay,
minutes. That's why I have to go. But we could
that's
continue
right.
part 2 one day. We'll
I
get
would
back
love
together
to
and
do
continue.
that.
There's a lot to talk about, Reverend.
Yes.
So
Thank you so much for this time. I really appreciate it.
it's been my honor, and I'd like to return to your show in future times, talk about new books. Perhaps I'll be releasing a Viktor Frankl, and we'll be working
Um,
together, hopefully, to really deeply influence the future of psychotherapy, because the future is
Wonderful.
logotherapy.
It sure is. I will end with there's a scripture that always comes to my mind when I think about logotherapy, and that is Jeremiah, where he says, "No longer will a man's neighbor know the Lord, for I will write my law upon his heart." And I think that there's a real sense in which logotherapy is aimed at the law that is written in the human heart.
Wonderful. So nice to meet you.
Thank you. Same here. God bless.
God bless.